Poland's center-left Prime Minister Donald Tusk has survived a vote of confidence in Parliament. Following the election of right-wing nationalist President Karol Nawrocki, Tusk called on lawmakers to show support for his government. Speaking in Parliament today before the vote, Tusk said his pro-EU coalition government has brought progress to Poland, and he insisted that he has a mandate from voters to push ahead with his agenda. Well, earlier, our correspondent Anchal Vohra in the Polish parliament in Warsaw explained to us how significant that win is for Donald Tusk today.
Well, it's quite significant for him because 243 parliamentarians voted for him while 210 voted against, which goes on to show that the parliament still backs him, even though in the president's office, the new president is a man backed by the opposition, the nationalist conservative Polish Law and Justice Party. This was important because after Karol Nawrocki, the new president, won the elections, his victory was seen as a referendum on Tusk himself. Now he can say he's got the parliament behind him and that he's got every right to push through his agenda. However, that does not in any way say that that journey ahead to push through reforms is going to get any easier, because Nawrocki is backed by the conservative nationalists and has the veto against any legislation that the parliament wants to pass.
That was Anchal Vohra there reporting. Well, from Warsaw now, I'm joined by Marcin, who is a senior advisor at the Warsaw Security Forum. Marcin, it's good to have you with us. Donald Tusk may have won the battle today, but it seems that he could still lose the war here. President Nawrocki has veto power. He can basically block all legislation introduced by Tusk. Isn't that a correct assessment?
It is a correct assessment. Tusk is in a very fragile position right now, and it will be extremely difficult for him to push forward the agenda that he won the last, forming the country after 8 years of the law and justice rule, reforming the constitutional institutions, the balance of powers, the rule of order, reforming the courts, pushing through legislation when it comes to civil unions, when it comes to women's reproductive rights. People voted for this change, and right now it's certain that this change won't happen under President Nawrocki. So it will be a very difficult legislative agenda for Tusk to push through, almost impossible, which means that his impact on changing the country the way that he'd want to will be, well, minimal at the very least. At the same time, the president can also... Go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to ask you, what happens if President Nawrocki blocks everything? I mean, when does he then become the problem in Polish politics? Well, unfortunately, today politics doesn't work this way, because the government is always perceived as the ones really governing every day, and it has the prerogative to do so. So even if the president blocks legislation and the government will try to put blame, rightly so, on President blocking change, politically it's almost certain that the electorate will simply blame the government for their everyday hurdles, for their everyday problems, or for lack of seeing change. So that's why Tusk is in a very difficult position politically. He needs to think a new way to communicate with the electorate, to position his party towards new voters, younger voters, towards voters who are more leaning towards populist parties, not necessarily fully nationalistic, but just the TikTok voters, the YouTube voters, the type of ones that supported Donald Trump and others. So this is what Tusk has to figure out. He's said in his expose today before the vote of confidence that he's going to change the communication strategy of the government, that he's going to assign a press secretary, which the government didn't have before. But there are many doubts among commentators whether this is not all too late. What are his chances of success here? I mean, he has to do this if he wants to survive politically, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He has to do it. The issue is that if we look at the points he's made today, he's basically summarized some of the things that the government has achieved in the last 2 years, but he hasn't really put out a new vision for the future about how he wants to change things, how he wants to make things differently under a
continuous blockage from the presidential palace of his agenda. So there's a big question mark, because just changing the communication narrative here, well, it seems it just won't be enough. So there might be some expectation of major reshuffles among the government. He mentioned he will do this in July. How far-reaching it will be, whether we'll see really a whole array of new faces that are not so closely aligned with the well-known for the last 15, 20 years faces of Polish politics, which the electorate, frankly speaking, is getting a little bit fed up with. This might be one of the moves that he has in his sleeve. Will he do it? That's a big question. The other major issue to remember, this is a coalition government. Tusk is not just himself in power. He's got coalition partners, either more on the left, either more towards the right of him, and they're both pushing their agendas. He's in the middle there. It's very hard to keep those coalition forces together. Today's vote was really an attempt, first and foremost, to keep them at the same page. But when the elections in 2027 come closer, the more the coalition partners will start asking questions, well, if our place is in the government, or if we're going to lose the election for sure if we stay. So these are the things we need to take a close watch at.
Let's pull this out and look at the geopolitical equation here. President Nawrocki and U.S. President Donald Trump, they are fond of each other. They're very open about that. Neither is a big fan of the European Union. How dangerous is this for the European project, in your opinion?
I don't see this as a major issue overall for a European project, because the Polish president doesn't have that strong prerogatives when it comes to European policy, when it comes to foreign policy. Moreover, I think that the current Tusk government, as it did with current President Duda, will try to encourage in a way those relations, because Poland is the most outspoken advocate for having the US engage in Europe, particularly the US military. So there will be, I think, this is one of the areas where the government might work with the president to try to have him build up this relationship. And also, let's be frank. I mean, there's no pre-existing relationship. They had a photo up in the White House arranged by some, far-right conservative members. The president, Trump, didn't know Nawrocki before that photo up, and now it's only they'll have the space to build this relation. But without doubt, for the conservative movement, for the populist movement, the type of parties like AfD, like Meloni's parties in Italy, like parties of course, of Orban's and Fico's, who get the support from the actors like J.D. Vance and the Trump administration, they will be aligning themselves with Nawrocki, as previously the Law and Justice Party did, seeing that this is their way to gain some political support in the times of a Tusk government.
Marcin Buzanski putting it all into context for us tonight. Marcin, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's get a view from Brussels with our correspondent, Jack Parrock. Welcome, Jack. How is Brussels' response to this result in Poland?
Well, they're going to be delighted. They're probably not going to see too many public statements to that effect. But what this does is secures Donald Tusk's position as Prime Minister, which sort of reaffirms the pro-EU agenda that he put forward. There are strong personal ties that he himself has to the institutions of the European Union, having led the European Council, so where all of the 27 EU governments get together to meet and discuss topics across the board. He was the president of the European Council for the 5 years before he then went back to Poland and retook the Prime Minister's job. So he knows people in this town. And I think that the sense will be that this allows Poland to stick to the mainstream of EU politics, which obviously the institutions of the European Union will be pleased about.
Let me put to you the same question I put to Anchal, because people looking at this will say, well, what has changed? This was a vote called by Donald Tusk, which he expected to win. Before this vote and before this new president, we had a right-wing president who was continuing to veto parliamentary proposals put forward by Donald Tusk. Now we have a different right-wing president who will do the same thing. So how does that change? Now that Tusk has restored the status quo, which appeared never to be in danger, how has that changed Poland's relationship with Brussels?
from the outside looking in, that's exactly the issue that the European Union is looking into Poland. You're quite right. Duda, the predecessor president in Poland, was vetoing a lot of the agenda, the reform agenda that was going to bring Poland back into sort of judicial reforms that the European Union wanted, financial reforms, stopping their sort of acts against some of the LGBTI community, for instance. That was part of the reform agenda. Nawrocki, the new president, looks likely even more strongly to veto that reform agenda. And what's interesting, there is sort of context to this, and that is that when Donald Tusk got re-elected into the Prime Minister's office in February of 2024, his agenda that he put forward allowed the European Commission to remove its block of up to 136 billion euros in funding for Poland through a raft of different funding mechanisms that were blocked because of the previous government's positions and because of their sort of anti-democratic, as the European Union saw it, policies. Now, they released that, and some of that funding has already been going to Poland. But one of the big questions has been, did they do it too early when Duda was promising, the previous president was promising to block and veto much of the reform agenda? Now, some of that money still continues to go to Poland. We expect more of it to go because they believe here in Brussels that that Tusk can push that agenda forward. With Nawrocki as the president, it looks just as difficult, if not more difficult. So you're right there. I mean, as far as the facts of the sort of structure of the politics in Poland right now, there doesn't seem to be much change. The one thing that Tusk can do is say, even after that presidential election, he can claim parliamentary legitimacy and credibility to continue his agenda with the parliament behind him.
Thanks for that, Jack. DW's Jack Parrock in Brussels.